It was the summer of 2009 when I decided to step away from the hustle of my daily life and spend some time in a secluded cabin deep in the forests of Wyoming. At 31 years old, I was living alone in a modest apartment in Salt Lake City, and the repetitive grind of work had left me drained. The idea of spending a week surrounded by nothing but nature and quiet felt like exactly what I needed. I came across the cabin on a rental website. It was described as small, rustic, and tucked away, just the kind of place I was looking for. According to the listing, it was about 25 miles from the closest town, accessible via an old, barely traveled dirt road. The pictures showed a quaint wooden cabin with a porch overlooking dense woods. No neighbors in sight. Sounded ideal. I packed only the basics: a few outfits, canned food, a portable stove, a flashlight, and a couple of novels. I also brought my trusty hiking boots and a map of the region. My plan was simple: unwind, do some reading, and maybe explore the nearby trails. The drive was mostly uneventful, but as I got closer, the roads became narrower and rougher. The tall trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a canopy that dimmed the sunlight. By the time I arrived, the evening light was casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. The place was exactly as promised: small, simple, and surrounded by nothing but wilderness. There was no cell service, no electricity, and no running water. My flashlight and the small lantern provided by the cabin would be my only sources of light after sundown. I didn't mind. I was eager for the solitude. The first evening was peaceful. I heated some canned soup on the stove and sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, and every so often, the rustling of leaves hinted at wildlife in the underbrush. It was calming, even therapeutic. The next morning, I decided to explore. The map indicated a few trails nearby, so I laced up my boots and set off. The forest was thick but beautiful, with towering pines and clusters of wildflowers. I followed a trail that led up a small hill, offering a breathtaking view of the area. For the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. After a day of hiking, I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon. That's when I noticed something strange. The lantern on the porch was off. I was sure I had left it on before I left. It wasn't a big deal, but it left me slightly uneasy. I told myself I must have forgotten to turn it on. That night, things began to feel off. As I lay in bed, the only sounds were the faint hum of insects outside. Then I heard it, a soft crunching noise, like footsteps on dirt. The path leading to the cabin was rough enough to make that sound, but I froze. The steps were deliberate, slow. They didn't sound like an animal. I told myself it was probably a deer or something similar, but my heart raced. Grabbing my flashlight, I shone it through the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the porch and clearing beyond. Nothing was there. I barely slept that night. The next day, I searched the area for signs of anyone else. There were no footprints or broken branches, nothing to suggest a visitor. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was all in my head. I went for a shorter hike that afternoon, but couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed quieter than before, the usual sounds of birds and insects muted. Occasionally, I heard faint rustling behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, circling the cabin. I stayed in bed, clutching my flashlight and a heavy wrench I'd found in a drawer. The steps stopped eventually, but I didn't dare look outside. By morning, I decided to cut my trip short. The tranquility I had sought was now overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. I packed my belongings and loaded them into my car. When I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. Trying not to panic, I decided to walk to the nearest town. It would take hours, but I had no other choice. About an hour into the walk, I noticed fresh footprints on the dirt road ahead of me. They were going in the same direction, but I hadn't seen anyone. I turned back, feeling the cabin was safer than the open road. Once there, I barricaded the door with a chair and spent the day watching the forest through the window. That night, the footsteps returned, heavier and closer. Something pounded on the door, making it shake. Then came scratching, like claws dragging across the wood. I stayed awake, gripping the wrench, until the sounds finally stopped. At first light, I packed up and left again, ignoring the footprints as I made my way to town. When I finally reached it, I called for a tow truck. Returning with the driver later, I found the cabin ransacked. I left without looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I've never returned to the woods. Some places are better left untouched. I've always been drawn to quiet places. Maybe it's because life feels so noisy and overwhelming, or maybe being alone just suits me better. That's why, when I saw an online ad for a small lodge nestled deep in the forest near an old burial ground, I jumped at the chance. It wasn't supposed to be a permanent escape, just a few days to get away from the noise. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was heading, only that I needed some time to recharge. The cabin was located on the outskirts of a small village in New Hampshire, far enough into the woods that even cell signals struggled to break through the dense canopy. The listing described the nearby graveyard as historic and serene, almost as if it were a highlight. Cemeteries never unsettled me. They were always just peaceful, quiet places. I arrived on a cool November afternoon. The leaves were shades of amber and gold, though the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The cabin looked older than the photos online, its wooden exterior worn by years of harsh weather, and its roof slightly bowed. The small, uneven windows added to its rustic charm. The air carried a sharp, earthy scent, a mix of damp leaves and fresh soil. Unpacking was quick since I'd brought only the essentials: clothes, food, a lantern, a novel, and a few tools. The cabin didn't have electricity, but there was an old wood stove for heat and cooking. It was everything I had hoped for. No interruptions, no technology, just the calm of the woods. After settling in, I decided to explore the area. The graveyard was a short walk from the cabin, down a narrow dirt trail. It was modest in size, with perhaps 40 or 50 headstones, most of them leaning or weathered by time. Some dated back to the early 19th century, their inscriptions barely visible. The place felt more forgotten than eerie. Towering trees surrounded the area, their branches weaving together overhead like a protective dome. The air felt colder and heavier under that canopy, but I brushed it off as the chill of the evening setting in. Before the sun vanished entirely, I made my way back to the cabin. That night, I lit a fire in the stove and read by the soft glow of a lantern. The wind picked up outside, making the trees sway and creak. Normally, those sounds would relax me, but here they felt different, like the woods were listening. The silence between the gusts carried a weight I couldn't explain. I turned in early, curling under a heavy quilt to fend off the creeping cold. Sleep didn't come easily. It was broken by faint noises, a rustling outside, the groan of a floorboard. I told myself it was the wind or the cabin settling. The next morning, I discovered the front door slightly ajar. I was certain I'd latched it the night before, but maybe I'd been mistaken. The wind could have pushed it open. Still, it left me uneasy. I spent the day chopping wood and wandering deeper into the forest, hoping to shake the feeling of discomfort. By late afternoon, I found myself near the cemetery again, drawn there without knowing why. The air was colder, and the shadows stretched farther than they had the day before. That's when I noticed it, a crumbling shed at the edge of the graveyard. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached. The shed was barely standing, its roof collapsed on one side and the door hanging loose. Inside, I found old, rusted gardening tools and a pile of decayed wood, alongside what looked like an animal's nest. It all seemed harmless, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching me. That night, the unease grew stronger. The noises outside the cabin became deliberate, footsteps crunching the leaves, circling the structure. I stayed in bed, gripping a flashlight tightly, but sleep was impossible. At one point, I thought I heard faint tapping on the window. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside to look for tracks or other signs of wildlife. The ground was undisturbed, and the door remained latched. None of it made sense. On the third night, the footsteps were louder, more deliberate, stopping and starting as if pacing toward the cabin before retreating. I stayed near the stove, clutching a flashlight in one hand and a hunting knife in the other, waiting for something or someone to appear. Then came the scratching at the door. It wasn't the random scuffling of an animal. It was too calculated. My heart pounded as I froze in place, unsure whether to confront it or stay hidden. The scratching stopped, and the silence that followed felt even heavier. When daylight arrived, I found deep scratches etched into the wood of the door, as if something or someone had tried to get in. That was enough for me. I packed my belongings, ready to leave. But when I tried to start the truck, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, though I hadn't left any lights or electronics on. It made no sense. Desperate, I decided to hike to the nearest road, hoping to flag down help. As I stepped onto the trail, something caught my eye. Footprints. They weren't mine and they weren't fresh. They had been there for days, circling the cabin and vanishing into the forest. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. Instead, I grabbed my bag and walked, never looking back. It took most of the day to reach the main road. When I finally flagged down a passing car, the driver looked at me like I'd survived something I couldn't explain. Maybe I had. I never went back to that cabin. A week later, the rental agency emailed, asking why I'd left early. I didn't reply. Some things are better left unspoken. But even now, late at night, I find myself wondering who or what was out there in the woods. And I wonder if they're still waiting. It was late October, and the rain poured relentlessly as I steered my car up the gravel path to a remote cabin I'd rented for 5 days. Hoping to leave behind the pressures of my job and the chaos of city life, I'd chosen a place far off the beaten track, nestled deep in the forest and a solid half-hour drive from the nearest paved road. Solitude was my goal, and solitude is what I found. There was no cell reception, no internet, and only the sound of rainfall mingling with the rustle of leaves in the wind. The cabin had a rough charm, to put it mildly. The timber siding had weathered to a silvery gray, and patches of moss clung to the uneven roof. A single, leaning chimney exhaled thin smoke from the wood-burning stove inside. Hurrying to escape the rain, I unloaded my luggage and stepped into the cabin, where the air carried the scent of damp wood and aged stone. The furnishings were sparse: an old couch, a battered kitchen table, and rickety chairs that looked like they might collapse under a strong breeze. The power in the area was hit or miss, and the owner had advised me to rely on the gas lanterns and the wood stove if the lights gave out. A small generator out back could power a few essentials if it came to that. After unpacking, I arranged my belongings in the simple wooden dresser in the bedroom and stocked the tiny kitchen with canned goods and snacks I'd brought along. Outside, the rain persisted as evening fell. I sat by the stove, soaking in the crackle of flames and the rhythmic drumming of raindrops on the roof. Occasionally, the wind whipped through the trees, making them creak and groan. At first, the quiet isolation was soothing, exactly what I had been yearning for. But as the hours crept by, the silence turned suffocating. Every noise seemed magnified. The creak of the floorboards, the distant snap of branches, even the sound of my own breathing. I tried distracting myself with a book, but my eyes kept wandering to the rain-streaked window. The distorted silhouettes of trees swayed in the storm, appearing to press closer against the cabin. A growing unease settled over me, as if I were being watched by unseen eyes just beyond the light's reach. Around midnight, the power flickered and died. I lit one of the gas lanterns and placed it on the table, its warm glow throwing shadows that seemed alive, twisting and shifting with the flickering flame. Brushing off the unease, I decided to check the generator. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out onto the porch. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the wind howled, bending the trees around me. The generator shed was about 40 feet from the cabin, tucked beneath a cluster of pines. Trudging through the soggy ground, my boots squelching with each step, I reached the shed. It was just as I'd left it earlier, the door slightly ajar. Inspecting the generator, I found no obvious issues, but it refused to start after several attempts. Frustrated and drenched, I turned to head back to the cabin and froze. There, in the mud near the shed, were footprints. They were larger and deeper than mine, as though made by someone heavier. A cold wave of fear swept over me. Shining the flashlight on the tracks, I saw they led away from the shed into the darkness of the woods. I whispered to myself that it could have been an animal, perhaps a moose, but the prints were too human-like. Heart pounding, I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me and shoving a chair against it for good measure. The night dragged on as I sat by the stove, knife in hand, listening for the faintest sound over the storm. A metallic scraping sound came from the front door, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps pacing the porch. I dared not move, my breath shallow and my pulse racing. When morning broke, the rain stopped, and I ventured outside to find fresh footprints circling the cabin. They lingered at the windows and door before disappearing into the woods. I wasted no time packing, tossing everything into the car in a frenzy and speeding down the muddy road. When I stopped at a gas station, the clerk remarked on how pale I looked. As I glanced at my boots to clean off the mud, my stomach sank. Imprinted in the dry dirt were footprints, ones that didn't belong to me. It was mid-December when my fiancée, Lisa, and I decided to step away from our hectic routines. Lisa worked as a nurse. Her shifts were grueling, with endless hours and constant demands that had taken a toll on her. I, on the other hand, worked from home as a freelance writer, and although my job wasn't as intense, the repetitiveness had begun to weigh on me. So, when Lisa suggested we retreat to a quiet cabin in the wilderness of Vermont for an extended weekend, I agreed without a second thought. We rented a small cabin deep in the forest. It was advertised as disconnected from the world, meaning no internet, no cell service, and no distractions. Just what we needed. The cabin was nestled near a frozen pond, surrounded by tall evergreens that stretched toward the sky. The nearest neighbor was about 6 miles away, and the closest town was nearly a 2-hour drive. Sounded perfect. We arrived late on a Friday evening. The air was crisp and biting, with the sun already sinking behind the treetops, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. The cabin itself was snug, a 1-story wooden structure with a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, and a small sleeping loft. Outside, a pile of firewood was stacked neatly, and a generator was available for limited use. We spent our first evening settling in. Lisa started a fire while I unpacked our bags. We cooked a simple meal, spaghetti with Jared sauce, and afterward we sat by the fire sipping tea, chatting about life and anything that came to mind. For the first time in weeks, Lisa seemed genuinely at ease. Her shoulders relaxed, and her laughter sounded unrestrained. The first night passed quietly. The silence of the forest was overwhelming at first, but it felt peaceful. We slept soundly in the loft, wrapped in heavy blankets to keep out the cold. The next morning, we decided to explore the area. Lisa wanted to hike to a nearby overlook that offered a panoramic view of the forest and the frozen pond. The trail wasn't marked but was easy enough to navigate, and we took our time, pausing to admire the stillness of the woods. The snow muffled all sound, leaving only the crunch of our boots and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. By noon, we reached the overlook. The view was breathtaking, an endless expanse of snow-laden trees stretching to the horizon. As we descended the trail, something unusual caught my attention. Tracks in the snow, large, irregular prints that didn't resemble those of any animal I could identify. They were too big for a deer and too erratic for a bear. I pointed them out to Lisa. She crouched to examine them, her expression becoming serious. She didn't say much, but I could sense her unease. Back at the cabin, Lisa went outside to fetch more firewood while I prepared lunch. When she returned, she seemed distracted, her movements unusually quiet. She didn't mention anything, but I recognized the look in her eyes, focused and tense. I didn't press her, trying instead to lighten the mood, though an undercurrent of unease lingered. That evening, as we sat by the fire, Lisa grew uncharacteristically silent, her eyes flicking to the windows occasionally. When I asked if everything was okay, she nodded and claimed she was just tired. We went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees and causing the cabin to groan. At times, I thought I heard faint crunching sounds outside, like footsteps in the snow. I told myself it was just the wind or some small animal, but the thought gnawed at me. The next morning, I woke to find Lisa standing by the window, staring into the woods. When I asked what she was looking at, she shrugged and said she thought she saw something moving among the trees. I peered out but saw only shadows and snow. We decided to stay near the cabin that day. The tracks from the day before had unsettled us both, though neither of us admitted it out loud. We spent the day reading, playing cards, and trying to ignore the growing tension. As night fell, the sense of isolation became almost suffocating. The wind had stilled, leaving behind an oppressive silence. We locked the doors and windows, more out of routine than necessity, and tried to relax. Lisa sat cleaning her pocket knife, a habit she had when she was nervous. I didn't comment and busied myself tidying up after dinner. Around midnight, I heard it again, that faint crunching sound outside. Lisa heard it too. She stood abruptly, her hand instinctively going to her flashlight. We both froze, straining to hear. The sound was deliberate, footsteps circling the cabin. Lisa motioned for me to stay put and moved toward the window, peering into the darkness. After a moment, she turned back, her face pale. "Stay here," she whispered. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside, closing the door softly behind her. I waited, my heart pounding. Minutes felt like hours. Then came the sharp crack of a single gunshot, followed by silence. The door flung open, and Lisa rushed in, breathless and flushed. Without a word, she locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. "What happened?" I finally managed to ask. She looked at me, her eyes wide and resolute. "We're leaving," she said. We packed hurriedly, leaving the cabin as it was. Lisa didn't tell me what she saw or shot at, and I didn't ask. We drove back to the city that night, the dark forest closing in around us as we sped down the icy road. Only after we were home did Lisa finally explain. She had seen a man standing at the tree line, dressed in dark clothes. When she called out, he didn't respond. When she shone her flashlight, he turned and disappeared into the woods. She had fired a warning shot out of fear. We reported the incident to the local authorities, but they found no evidence, no footprints, no sign of anyone. To this day, we don't know who he was or why he was there. The experience left a lingering chill, a reminder of how vulnerable we'd been in that secluded cabin. We haven't returned to the woods since. The year was 1995, and I had been working as a forester for nearly a decade. My boss, Mr. Redford, ran a thriving timber company near the outskirts of Missoula, Montana. He was a hard-nosed man, known for his no-nonsense approach and high expectations. If you wanted to stay employed, you followed orders and delivered results. Over the years, I had seen more than a few workers quit after failing to meet his standards. One morning, Mr. Redford called me into his office and handed me a new assignment. He wanted a batch of the finest, cleanest spruce logs we could source. "Go far," he said, tapping a map spread out on his desk. "Find untouched ground where the trees are older than you." I nodded and soon found myself gathering my tools and supplies for a week-long trip into the wilderness. Solo trips like this weren't new to me, but this one felt different. The area Mr. Redford marked was deep in the Lolo National Forest, miles past any existing logging trails. The map led to a remote section that hadn't been disturbed in decades. I'd have to hike most of the way and set up camp near an old ranger's cabin that hadn't seen use in years. I set out early the next morning, driving my truck as far as the narrow dirt road would allow before the trail disappeared into dense forest. From there, it was a 3-mile trek to the cabin. My pack was loaded with everything I'd need: an axe, a small saw, rope, food, and a tent in case the cabin was uninhabitable. The trail was overgrown, and it was clear no one had been through recently. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I pushed forward. The air was heavy, and the usual forest sounds, birds, rustling leaves, were replaced by an unsettling quiet. When I reached the cabin, I was relieved to see it was still standing. It was small, with weathered wooden walls and a sagging roof, but it would serve its purpose. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay. The furnishings were sparse: a wobbly table, a couple of chairs, and a cot with a moldy mattress. I unpacked, cleaned up the space as best I could, and got to work. The first few days passed without incident. During the day, I scouted the area, marking promising trees. At night, I returned to the cabin to sharpen my tools and plan for the next day. By the 4th day, I had a respectable pile of logs ready for transport. That's when things started to feel strange. At first, it was just a feeling like I was being watched. While working in the woods, I'd occasionally feel the hairs on my neck rise. I'd stop and look around, but nothing ever seemed out of place. Then, on the 5th morning, I noticed boot prints outside the cabin. They weren't mine. I always cleaned my boots before entering. The prints were fresh, leading into the forest before vanishing. That night, I heard noises outside the cabin, footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Grabbing my axe, I stepped outside and shone my flashlight into the dark woods. Nothing. The forest swallowed the light, and the sounds stopped as suddenly as they'd started. By the 6th day, I was on edge. I told myself it was fatigue or isolation playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. As evening fell, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. Slowly, I turned, clutching my axe. About 20 yards away, partially hidden behind a tree, stood a man. He was tall and wiry, dressed in a tattered coat and jeans. His face was pale, and his eyes locked on me. He didn't move or speak, just stared. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, stepping forward instead. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. Grabbing my gear, I headed back to the cabin, my heart pounding. Once inside, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle. I sat by the window, axe in hand, watching the dark forest. Hours passed, each creak of the cabin making my heart race. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, circling the cabin this time. They were slow and deliberate. Then came a loud thud against the back wall, followed by another, as if someone was striking it with a heavy object. I stood frozen, clutching my axe, as the sounds stopped and silence returned. At first light, I packed my gear and left without a second thought. The hike back to my truck was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man again. When I finally reached the truck, I tossed my gear in and drove away, not stopping until I was miles from the forest. I never told Mr. Redford the full story. I simply said the area wasn't suitable for logging and suggested we look elsewhere. He didn't press me for details, and I didn't offer any. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Perhaps he was just a wanderer who stumbled upon my camp, or maybe he'd been watching me the entire time. All I know is I'll never return to that part of the woods. It was the summer of 2017 when my wife, Lily, and I decided to escape the hustle of New York City and spend some time at her late grandmother's cabin. The cabin was tucked away deep in the forests of central Wisconsin, far from any main roads or cell phone reception. Lily's family hadn't visited the place in many years, but she had vivid memories of it from her childhood. She described the scent of the pine walls, the sound of the lake beyond the trees, and the kind of stillness that felt almost tangible. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but after months of grueling late nights working as a graphic designer, I was ready for some tranquility. The plan was straightforward: spend a week at the cabin, unwind, and enjoy the peace and quiet. We arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The gravel road leading to the cabin was overgrown, requiring careful maneuvering to avoid scratching the underside of the car. When we finally reached the clearing, the cabin appeared smaller than I had anticipated. It was a single-story structure with a weathered wooden exterior, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to press in tightly. Stepping out of the car, I inhaled the crisp, pine-scented air. The silence was almost unsettling. No distant hum of traffic, no birds singing, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Lily smiled as she approached the cabin, a set of keys jingling in her hand. Inside, the air was stale, and a thin layer of dust covered everything. The furniture was old but sturdy, and shelves lined the walls, holding worn books and various trinkets. A stone fireplace occupied one corner of the living room, and the small kitchen looked functional but dated. The place had charm, though it also carried a sense of neglect, like it had been waiting too long for visitors. We spent the first couple of hours cleaning. Lily swept the floors while I carried our bags inside and explored the back porch. From there, I could see the lake through the trees. It was small, more of a pond really, with still, dark water that mirrored the green canopy above. That evening, we sat on the porch with glasses of wine, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The sky turned from deep orange to purple, and finally to a velvety black filled with more stars than I had ever seen back in the city. It was breathtaking, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia. The next morning, Lily suggested we explore the property. The cabin sat on roughly 5 acres of land, mostly dense forest. As we ventured through the woods, it was clear no one had been here in a long time. Fallen branches blocked overgrown trails, and moss had overtaken the ground. We reached the edge of the lake, where Lily pointed out an old dock. It was partially submerged and coated in algae. She mentioned fishing there with her grandfather when she was young. As we stood there, I noticed something odd on the far side of the lake, a patch of ground where trees were missing, leaving an unnatural clearing. It looked as though the trees had been ripped out by their roots. I pointed it out, but Lily shrugged, suggesting it could have been a storm. The rest of the day passed peacefully. We explored, ate, and read. By nightfall, I felt more at ease. We lit a fire in the fireplace and played a card game, laughing until the flames died down. But when it came time to sleep, I couldn't. The silence of the cabin made every sound stand out. The creak of the wooden floors, the distant croak of frogs near the lake, the occasional thud from somewhere outside. I tried convincing myself it was just the old structure settling, but something felt off. The following morning, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate the clearing by the lake. Lily stayed behind with a book while I laced up my boots and headed out. The forest felt different, denser, with an almost suffocating humidity. When I reached the clearing, I froze. The ground was bare, marked with deep gouges and scorch marks. At the center was a pile of something I couldn't immediately identify. As I stepped closer, I realized it was a heap of bones. They weren't human, but were too large to belong to raccoons or deer. The bones were scattered, as though something had torn the animals apart and left the remains here. A chill ran down my spine. Forcing myself to look around, I noticed claw marks running vertically along the surrounding trees, their bark stripped. Whatever had been here was big. I didn't linger long. On my way back to the cabin, I felt the eerie sensation of being followed. Every so often, I heard a crack or rustle behind me, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. When I returned, I told Lily what I had seen. She looked uneasy but dismissed it as the work of a bear. I didn't argue, though I knew it wasn't a bear. That night, the noises outside were louder. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, heavy footsteps. I stayed awake, heart pounding. Around 2 a.m., there was a loud thump against the side of the cabin. Lily stirred but didn't wake. Grabbing a flashlight, I cautiously opened the door. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only trees. Just as I was about to retreat, a low, guttural growl echoed from the direction of the lake. I shut the door and locked it, certain I didn't want to know what was out there. The next morning, we decided to leave early. While Lily packed, I inspected the car. Deep scratches marred the passenger side, as though something with claws had raked it. We didn't waste any time. As we drove down the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw movement in the trees. Something was watching us leave, but I didn't stop to find out what. We never returned to the cabin. Lily's family sold it a few years later. To this day, I don't know what I encountered out there, but I do know one thing. I'll never feel at ease in a forest again.